The sun hung low over the dusty plains of New Mexico Territory in 1883, casting long shadows across Jack Morrison's modest cattle ranch. He'd spent the better part of the afternoon mending fences when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the cattle. It was labored breathing, coming from somewhere near the creek bed that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Jack set down his tools and walked cautiously toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Times were tense between the settlers and the Apache people, and a man couldn't be too careful. But what he found when he pushed through the scrub brush wasn't a threat at all. It was a young Apache man, barely more than a boy really, collapsed against a cottonwood tree. His leg was badly injured, twisted at an unnatural angle, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. The young man's eyes fluttered open as Jack approached, and there was fear in them, the kind of fear that comes from expecting the worst. Jack had seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded animals and desperate men. He raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Easy there, son," Jack said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The young Apache tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Jack could see he'd been out here for at least a day, maybe more. Without another thought, Jack knelt down and carefully examined the injured leg. It was broken, that much was clear, but it didn't look like the bone had pierced the skin. That was good. That he could work with. Jack lived alone since his wife Martha had passed 3 years prior, and his nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. He couldn't leave the boy here while he went for help, and he couldn't move him far with that leg. So he did what Martha would have done. He decided to help. "I'm going to take you to my house," Jack said, knowing the young man probably didn't understand much English. "I'll set that leg and get some water in you." It took considerable effort, but Jack managed to fashion a makeshift stretcher from fence posts and his coat. He carefully loaded the young Apache onto it and dragged him back to the ranch house. Once inside, he laid him on the spare bed that hadn't been used since Martha's sister visited 2 Christmases ago. Over the next several hours, Jack worked with the steady hands of a man who'd set bones before, both human and animal. He set the leg as best he could, splinted it with wooden slats, and wrapped it tight. He gave the young man water, slowly at first, then soup made from salt pork and vegetables. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, but by nightfall, his fever had broken and his eyes had cleared. "What's your name?" Jack asked, sitting in the chair beside the bed. The young man looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Nate," he said quietly. Then, in surprisingly clear English, he added, "You are kind to help me. My people will remember this." Jack waved a hand dismissively. "Any decent person would do the same. You just rest now. That leg's going to take some time to heal." For the next 3 days, Jack tended to his unexpected guest. He changed the bandages, brought food and water, and even sat with Nate in the evenings, the two of them sharing stories despite the language barrier and the tensions that existed between their peoples. Jack learned that Nate had been separated from his group during a dispute with soldiers and had fallen from his horse while fleeing. He'd been trying to make his way back when the injury and exposure had overwhelmed him. On the 4th morning, Jack woke to find Nate's bed empty. His heart sank, worried the young man had tried to leave before he was ready. But then he looked out the window and saw Nate standing in the yard, leaning heavily on a crutch Jack had fashioned for him, staring toward the eastern hills. Jack walked outside. "You planning on leaving?" Nate turned to him and nodded. "My people will worry. I must return." "That leg isn't healed enough for travel," Jack protested. "I will manage," Nate said. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch hanging from a cord around his neck. He opened it and removed a single turquoise stone, perfectly smooth and the color of a summer sky. He pressed it into Jack's hand. "For your kindness. This belonged to my grandfather." Jack tried to refuse, but Nate insisted. "You saved my life when you could have left me to die or worse. This is a debt that must be honored." By noon, Nate had disappeared into the landscape as if he'd never been there at all, leaving Jack standing in his dusty yard with a turquoise stone and a strange feeling that his life had just changed in some fundamental way. The next morning, Jack was in his barn tending to his horses when he heard the sound of hoofbeats. Not just 1 or 2 horses, but many. His blood ran cold. A group of riders approaching a remote ranch rarely meant good news. He stepped out of the barn and froze at what he saw. Riding toward his property were at least 20 Apache warriors, their horses moving in perfect formation. At the front rode a man who could only be described as magnificent. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a bearing that spoke of absolute authority. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and his weathered face was framed by long gray hair. Behind him rode Nate, still using the crutch but sitting straight and proud on his horse. Jack's neighbors had told him stories about the great Apache leaders, men whose names were spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. As the riders approached, Jack noticed that several of the warriors carried rifles, though none were pointed in his direction. The group stopped about 20 yards from Jack's porch, and the older man dismounted with the grace of someone half his age. Nate dismounted as well, hobbling forward on his crutch. He spoke to the older man in Apache, gesturing toward Jack, and the older man's eyes fixed on the rancher with an intensity that made Jack's mouth go dry. Then the older man walked forward, and Nate followed. When they were close enough for conversation, Nate spoke. "This is Victorio's brother, a chief of our people. I am his grandson. You saved the grandson of a chief, and for this, he has come to honor the debt." Jack's mind reeled. He'd heard the name Victorio, everyone in the territory had. Victorio had been one of the most formidable Apache leaders before his death a few years back. If this was Victorio's brother, Jack was standing in the presence of Apache royalty. The chief spoke, and Nate translated. "My grandfather says that you showed kindness to one of our people when many would have shown cruelty. You asked for nothing. You expected nothing. This is the mark of a man of honor." Jack didn't know what to say. "I just did what any decent person would do," Nate translated, and the chief's stern face broke into something that might have been a smile. He spoke again, and Nate continued translating. "My grandfather says that many settlers would have killed me or left me to die. Some would have turned me over to the soldiers for bounty. You did none of these things. You treated me as you would treat your own son." The chief then gestured to the warriors behind him. Two of them rode forward, leading 3 horses, beautiful animals, strong and well-trained. Behind them, another warrior carried bundles wrapped in hide. "My grandfather offers you these gifts," Nate explained. 3 horses from our best stock. Blankets woven by our women. Dried meat enough for a season. And something more important, his word that you and your property will be protected. No Apache will harm you or steal from you. You have the friendship of our people." Jack was overwhelmed. "This is too much. I don't need payment for doing what's right." But the chief shook his head firmly when this was translated. "It is not payment," Nate said. "It is honor. To refuse would be to dishonor the gift. In our way, a debt of life must be acknowledged." Jack nodded slowly, understanding. "Then I accept, with gratitude and respect." The chief stepped forward and placed his hand on Jack's shoulder, speaking directly to him in Apache. Though Jack didn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. Then the chief did something even more remarkable. He removed a medallion from around his neck, a silver disc decorated with turquoise stones, and placed it over Jack's head. "This belonged to Victorio," Nate said quietly. "My grandfather gives it to you. Any Apache who sees this will know you are under the protection of our family. You are granted safe passage through our lands." As the warriors prepared to leave, Nate lingered for a moment. "Thank you, Jack Morrison," he said, and Jack realized it was the first time the young man had used his name. "You will always have friends among the Apache." Jack watched as they rode away, disappearing into the landscape as silently as they had come. He stood in his yard for a long time after they'd gone, holding the medallion, surrounded by 3 magnificent horses and gifts he'd never expected. In the months and years that followed, Jack Morrison found that the chief's promise was kept absolutely. While other ranchers in the territory faced raids and conflicts with Apache groups, Jack's property remained untouched. Once, when a young warrior unfamiliar with the arrangement approached Jack's land, an older Apache rode up and spoke sharply to him, pointing at the medallion Jack wore. The young warrior immediately backed away and rode off. Jack never sought to exploit this protection or to boast about it. He continued to treat any Apache he encountered with the same respect and decency he'd shown Nate that day by the creek. Word spread among both the settlers and the Apache that Jack Morrison was a man of honor, and his ranch became a sort of neutral ground where occasionally, in times of greatest tension, quiet meetings could happen between those seeking peace. Jack kept the turquoise stone and the medallion until his death many years later, and in his will, he left instructions that they be returned to the Apache people with a message: "I was honored to know them as friends." The story of the rancher and the chief became part of the oral history of both communities, a reminder that even in the hardest times, compassion and honor could bridge the deepest divides. It proved that one act of simple human kindness, done without expectation of reward, could change not just individual lives but the course of understanding between entire peoples.